The Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy might go down as one of the most perplexing projects in gaming history. After the beginning point Final Fantasy VII Remake on PS4, the sequel called Rebirth would up the ante quite drastically, boasting a mind-numbing production value to bring the second part of the original 1997 game to life in all new HD glory. A reminder, the first remake barely covered the opening hours of the old PS1 game, which only took place inside the single city of Midgar, where the mercenary Cloud Strife teams up with the vigilante group Avalanche to overthrow the evil Shinra company, which is draining the planet of its resources, while also trying to uncover the secrets around his arch-nemesis, Sephiroth. There is nothing quite like the globe-trotting adventures and cyber fantasy of this series, not last because on the most basic level, no other competitor pours this much budget into their J-pop extravaganza, with Rebirth being a prime example. Traveling the globe to recruit new party members and defeat foes while getting to the bottom of a grand planetary mystery is no longer confined to miniature maps. So the first mind-boggling part of FF7 Rebirth is that they took the abstract concept of an old-school JRPG map and recreated the majority of its settings with the size of a quote-unquote realistic-looking open world, which you can travel with all your classic vehicles. Something like the Gongaga Forest, which was once nothing but a couple of pre-rendered 4x3 screens, has become a full-fledged jungle set piece. And that's just one of many backdrops. Not to mention that besides the old content, there are many additional dungeons and settings. The days of Square Enix excusing the linear corridor design of Final Fantasy XIII by saying that HD towns are hard to make are truly long over. Not to mention that the game boasts a big roster of enemies and boss fights. There might be purists not satisfied with anything but a turn-based combat system, but to me, the FF7 remake has nailed the best of both worlds. While focused on action, it remains essential to issue manual commands for spells and special attacks, ultimately keeping the spirit of the tactics inherent to turn-based JRPGs, while also providing lots of graphical spectacle which requires real-time reflexes, making for something that's more engaging than pure action systems like in FF16. There's quite a bit of repetition in the content of its open world, but let's be real, your typical JRPG miniature map usually felt pretty formulaic too. At the very least, for a Ubisoft-esque tower activating game, the world itself is still good enough in leading you with its environmental design, in particular if you just want to rush to the next story set piece. So it doesn't necessarily feel like following a checklist of icons. Hand-holding has also been toned down a little compared to other Square games, even if it is far from a hardcore dungeon crawler. Unlike FF16 for example, which laid out literally every step with breadcrumbs, in Rebirth, investigating an area actually means investigating an area yourself. And while not nearly all of the new side activities and minigames are home runs, they still make the world feel a little more alive. A good in-world card game can never hurt. For all intents and purposes, Rebirth could be a whole new mainline Final Fantasy game in anything but story. And there comes the biggest crux of the game. Rebirth might have been the most ambitious traditional JRPG at the time of its release, but the story makes it quite inaccessible as a true definitive game experience of this kind. Not only because it's almost mandatory to play FF7 Remake first, which despite a smaller scope is still extremely long. On top of that, this remake trilogy isn't so much a true remake, but a pseudo-sequel to the very first Final Fantasy VII on PS1, because Remake introduced new destiny spirits that changed the original lore. In Rebirth, there's a whole new arc stemming from these new elements, which can be suspenseful for people familiar with the PS1 game, but also makes it hard to comprehend to anyone who isn't. Besides that, old characters are introduced introduced in different places of the timeline, and impact is lost if you didn't know the old plot. You could argue it goes even so far to rely on your knowledge of the real-world perception of FF7, as some of the plot plays with the expectations regarding some of the old twists. Weirdly enough, Rebirth in long stretches also follows the original plotline like it was made for newcomers, but it never quite fits together as a traditionally told story. While this guarantees controversy among fans, if nothing else, it's also quite a bold move. Especially because a traditional remake has been one of the more prevalent wishes in hardcore gaming internet discourse ever since Square produced a graphical Final Fantasy VII HD teaser for PlayStation 3. Yet it would seem that Square Enix saw a false premise in this. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth feels like the most expensive fan fiction ever made, but the fanbase who can really appreciate that is anything but mainstream, despite how beloved FF7 is among a certain demographic. No doubt, the Final Fantasy series paved the way for JRPGs, and FF7 in particular pushed the popularity for the genre and Japanese media outside of Japan quite a lot, as one of the defining and most successful games on the original PlayStation, which in itself ushered in a new gaming mainstream. But 1997 is not 2020 nor 2024 and beyond. At this point, gaming discourse just did not revolve around Final Fantasy anymore, let alone 7. This experiment came too late, and the argument from some developers that the same story all over again would have been boring doesn't make much sense, as the plot is heavily expanded with tons of new backstories, characters, and much more pompous cutscene presentation anyway. Cut out the whole meta-narrative and the remakes would have still been all new, but with that kind of story content in, it's simply less coherent. With that in mind, meaning the story not holding this adventure together as well as it should, it's hard to ignore where the competition has moved past its initiator, because Rebirth also came out in one of the most stacked years for big hitter RPGs from Japan. As big as it might be, the not so deep dungeon design and predictable world elements cannot compete with the exploration design of Shadow of the Erdtree or Dragon's Dogma 2. As an old school JRPG with an anime style plot, it's not quite as engaging as something like Eiyuden Chronicles, and as a playful JRPG sandbox with tons of side activities, it isn't as elegant as Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, while as a more casual gamer orientated JRPG, it was also facing a whole bunch of competition from Atlas. But make no mistake, the ingredients for a classic new age JRPG are still here. If this game was FF16 or 17 as a self-contained game, it would easily be one of the strongest HD Final Fantasy games. It's just that with its new convoluted Kingdom Hearts tier story structure, it makes its own case a little complicated.